Yellow and Red, mixed by Digis27, Chapter 13. Naruto would have literally leapt out of the bed in excitement if it wasn't for the bundle of red hair pressed up against him. Instead, as to avoid the likely punch to the gut, he merely shifted his position slightly, noting the strange feel of something tugging at the boxers he wore. He turned a most violent shade of red when he realized exactly what it was, and his eyes opened wide. He was most definitely awake now, although he hoped he couldn't say the same for his friend. Get your knee out of my ass, cheek shithead. Naruto would have sighed in relief if he didn't think that it would have alerted Tayuya to his friend's wake-up. He quickly adjusted himself before sliding out from behind Tayuya, still thoroughly embarrassed by everything that had happened so far. He heard her mumble, complaining about him taking away her heat, but right now he felt like enough of it was rushing to his cheeks. He had a long shower and only risked getting out when he was sure that he wouldn't have a repeat of this morning. For the longest time he just stared at it, wondering what the hell was going on today. It had certainly never done that before. It was such an awkward situation because usually he would go to Tayuya about things like this, except for some reason he didn't think that would be the best idea. Then again, they so rarely held secrets from one another, and even if they did, it was never for very long. Naruto felt so conflicted about what to do before his sleep-addled mind finally realized he had another friend, one that was more likely to understand his situation. He still felt uncomfortable about keeping something from his oldest friend, but right now he could live with it if it meant avoiding the inevitable embarrassment. In fact, now that he thought about it, Naruto couldn't even think why he was embarrassed at all, but he knew that he should be. He got dressed very quickly, smiled as he saw that Tayuya had barely moved, instead only wrapped the sheets around her tighter to ward off the cold that Naruto's absence created. In her mind, he was still better than any blanket, like her own personal heater. The thought brought a smile to her half-asleep face, and she snuggled back into the bed, desperately trying to soak up the last of the warmth he left imprinted on the mattress. Little did Naruto know that he wasn't the only one that would start to have strange sensations that morning, although having had the talk with Tayuya at least understood what they were, even if she didn't quite understand why they were happening. She neglected to tell Naruto because she honestly thought he wouldn't care. After her equally long, if not slightly longer shower, she stepped out of the bathroom with the towel wrapped around her body. The benefit of having Naruto being a morning person and her most certainly not being a morning person meant she always had the room to herself once he had gotten ready. She looked at the curtained window and the weak light that was barely able to filter through the tiny gap. Chuckling to herself, she figured Naruto was out training right about now. He was so predictable to her it wasn't even amusing. Well, okay, it was a little amusing to her. Of course, she never would have expected him to be in the room next to theirs, talking with Gaara about subjects that were quickly bringing a blush to the sand wielder's otherwise impassive face. Naruto, do you really think I'm the best person to talk with this about? Naruto just looked at him funnily, his eyebrows raised in a curious manner. Gaara just sighed. He loved his friend like a brother, possibly more, yet he could be a real idiot sometimes. You're the one that reads about those perverted books. I would think you would know more about this than me, he said in his normal deadpan manner, but he still couldn't hide the trace embarrassment that crept in. Hey, they're not perverted. Gaara just put his palm to his forehead, trying to stave off the headache this conversation was surely going to give him. Naruto, did you even listen to me? Don't you read the other parts of those books? Naruto nodded, his own small blush now developing as he thought back to some of the more heated moments in his favorite literary series. Doesn't that explain how everything works? Naruto looked confused for a moment before squinting his eyes and concentrating on what the scenes actually said. It didn't help that he usually skimmed over them, only picking up the barest of details. Suddenly his eyes shot out to the size of dinner plates, which would have been an amusing sight if Gaara didn't know what he was thinking about. Oh, so that's what the author's always talking about, he smiled, feeling pleased with himself for working it out on his own, until he realized just what he worked out. Red once again covered his face as he realized just what his little friend meant when it pressed against Tayuya like that. Oh, crap, Gaara. You have to help me control it. It was the redhead's turn to open his eyes wide. What the hell do you mean, control it? Naruto opened his mouth, ready to reply in his usual hot-headed manner, but his mind drew a blank and he ended up looking like some comical imitation of a fish. He flopped back down onto Gaara's bed. Oh man, what am I going to do? I need to talk to someone about this. But who? A large man with long, spiky, white-haired sneezed loudly, only saved from being located thanks to the privacy seal he had drawn up for himself that kept the worst of his giggling from being heard. He rubbed his nose, smirking to himself. Some foxy young lady must be talking about me to her friends. Jirai, you old fiend, you. I've still got it. He happily returned to writing notes in his small journal. The research was progressing well today. Gaara just looked at him. As long as his friend was, there was no real point asking someone who knew less about it that you did, so Naruto just resigned himself. He tried to clear his mind by training, using the harsh physical exercise to exhaust his mind and body. He was rather upset. Today had started out so well, and now he was as confused as he had been the first time he noticed Tayuya start to change. This was how Hana found him, the scent of his sweat drawing her over. It was unusual because most Inuzakas trained with their companions out in the training fields. She wasn't afraid to admit that the scent of sweat and hard training aroused her slightly. Her family did share almost too much in common with dogs after all. That was why she was surprised to find Naruto out behind his building up in a tree doing pull-ups. Except he was a shinobi and Naruto, so there had to be some unique slant to it. To work himself that little bit extra, he was upside down with his feet stuck to a high branch, using only chakra. She watched him for a few minutes as he lifted his body up until he could touch his toes before allowing his body to return to a vertical position in a controlled manner. It was impressive to say the least, although she had seen similar workouts from Might Guy. Of course, the young shinobi up in the tree had significantly better fashion sense than the self-proclaimed handsome beast of the Leaf Village. She smirked, not noticing as Naruto suddenly dropped out of the tree, spotting her for the first time. Oh, hi Hana. Sorry if I disturbed you. She looked up from her thoughts, nearly jumping when she found Naruto right next to her. She cursed. With her enhanced senses, she should have noticed him before he got anywhere near that close. Oh no, Naruto, I was just curious to see who was training back here. She looked him over curiously, something that seemed to be more common the longer she was around the strange Sand Shinobi. Don't you have the first round of the tuning exam today? Why are you at training? He just shrugged, grimacing as his scent finally caught up to him. I never miss an opportunity in the morning, he said it with a smile as he was walking away, obviously for his second shower this morning. Just then an idea occurred to him, and some bread invaded the bright of his nose as he turned to look back at Hana. Hana. She had been bemusedly watching him leaving until he had turned around, catching her staring, and even though he didn't notice, some red managed to invade her own cheeks. Yes, Naruto. He walked back to her, still blushing slightly as he fought for the right words to say. Kiba said you're a vet, so you work with animals, right? Like a medic? She smirked, wondering where this was going. Actually, I am a medic, Nin. I'm just a vet as well because it suits our clan. Humans are just animals after all. He seemed even more pleased with her answer. Well, so what does it mean when... He started blushing more profusely and in the end just started lowering his hand and motioning to his lower region. Hannah didn't quite get what he meant at first until realization struck and she had to fight back a laugh. Oh, don't worry about that, pup. It just means you're growing up, is all. He seemed rather sated by that, but suddenly took notice of what she had called him. Hey, I'm not a pup, Hannah just chuckled, walking past Naruto and ruffling his already unruly hair. Oh, but you are a pup. Naruto looked particularly irritated by the contact, but managed to control himself long enough to turn and call back to her. So that's it? It's just natural? She chuckled again, having to remind herself just how young Shinobi started. It seemed like an odd thought considering she was only 4 years his senior, but then again, she was in Uzaka and they all learned this stuff at a very young age. Perfectly. Come and see me sometime and I'll explain it better to you. She left Naruto feeling rather awkward as he quickly hurried back inside to grab another shower before the three of them had to go for the first round. They walked through the building, marveling at just how many ninja of all nationalities except Iwa and Kumo were here. They walked up the stairs and Naruto was about to walk into a corridor when Tayuya grabbed him from behind. What are you doing, shithead? Room 301. Naruto looked at her strangely and motioned at the classroom down the hall, where a few of the entrants were huddled around the doorway. Yeah, that's room 301. The Yuyu just glared at him and Gaara let slip a rare smile. You fucktard, that's obviously a genjutsu. Honestly, after all this time, you'd think you'd be able to see the basic fucking ones like that. He rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. Now that it had been pointed out, he could in fact spot the rather obvious genjutsu placed on the classroom sign. The problem for him with genjutsus was that his heightened senses meant when a genjutsu was placed over him, it made everything seem even more real. It was the one weakness to his usually advantageous ability. Yeah, sorry. The Yuya just playfully slapped him on the back of his head for being an idiot, not really in the mood for fighting. She wouldn't admit it, but she was almost as excited for this as Naruto was. She saw it as the first true test for her skills that would actually have some evidence to help her evaluate herself. She couldn't honestly give a damn if she made Chunin or not. The next exams were in Suna after all, so she would easily ace those if it was the challenge she relished. They made it to the correct room this time. Naruto still acting sheepish over his blunder. They entered into the crowded classroom. Nobody even bothered to turn for the new arrivals. The room was nearly full to capacity anyway. The trio shrugged and made their way over to the back of the staggered classroom where Tamari, Kankuro, and their teammate were sitting. They took a seat next to their fellow Sannin and actually awaited the arrival of the proctor. Naruto looked around, scoping out some of the competition. He quickly spotted the Konoha getting, and there were quite a lot of them. He counted 12 rookies and a few others that were obviously retaking. He noticed one of the older ones, the one with glasses and odd white hair, approached the younger shinobi and laid out cards before them. With his decent sight, Naruto could at least pick out they were some kind of information cards, although on what, he couldn't figure out. What he did know was that he did not like that the young man he smelled all too familiar. It was weaker and almost second-hand, but there was the unmistakable scent of snakes and deep underground places about the odd man. He tried to listen in on their conversation, but through the throng of people, all conversation with one another, he could only pick out scattered fragments. Everyone got a shock, however, as a strange hunched over shinobi with a large metal gauntlet took a swap at the bespectacled Leafnin. Naruto watched on curiously as he dodged the blow, yet even so, his glasses cracked and he keeled over, clutching his ears. Naruto immediately guessed sonic attack. He was definitely going to have to be wary about that one. He couldn't help but smirk as the Leaf Ninja writhed on the floor in pain before noticing just who had attacked him. Sound Ninja. They were told to be wary of them. There was no solid evidence suggesting they were involved with the Orochimaru. However, from the way he would have had the Sand ally with them, it was an educated guess that they were. They certainly lived up to their namesake if they really did use sound-based attacks. Naruto noticed he wasn't the only one fixated on their odd method of fighting, as he saw Taiyo riveted on the bandage to Shinobi's gauntlets. He was about to comment on that, most likely in a sarcastic manner, when what looked like a large smoke bomb erupted at the front of the room. Alright, you baby-faced degenerates, pipe down and listen up. It's time to begin. I am Ibiki Morino, your proctor, and from this moment, your worst enemy. When everyone was sitting in their proper places, more specifically away from their teammates, and Ibiki had explained the rules, everyone began the test in front of them. Naruto just stared at it with wide eyes. There were only 9 questions, but each one looked like it was more suited to an Anbu exam, not Chunin. Half the stuff on this sheet of paper looked more like advanced arithmetic rather than stuff that could actually help with being a ninja. And what was all that about about point deduction if caught cheating? That in itself was weird. Why wouldn't they just disqualify you outright for catching you doing something like that? Naruto just practically despairing as he repeatedly but softly, as to not interrupt the other candidates, banged his head on the table. He stopped after a few moments, realizing that he might be misinterpreting misinterpreted as some kind of code. Luckily for Naruto, he was not alone in the room, and a few minutes into the test, he began to notice the sand coalescing on his desk, just to the right of his paper. Quickly it formed into words, then sentences. Soon, all the answers to the test were right in front of him. He smiled at himself, reminded himself to thank Gaara after this was all done. Note that he was using his third eye technique to gain the answers before sending them to him and most likely Tayuya. He didn't exactly like the idea of cheating to get by, but if it meant he carried on further into the exam, he could live with it. Finally finished, he made a distinct but short tapping motion with his foot, and immediately the sand dispersed, floating back into fine particles. No doubt on their way back to Gaara's gourd, he leaned back on his chair, rather comfortable now that he didn't have to worry. In his panic, he had barely noticed that a few other teams had been caught cheating enough times to earn disqualification. Now that he was safe, he could watch as the numbers slowly whittled down in threes. It seemed a bit unfair that one person's cheating meant disqualification for their entire team, but then again, if his had been caught, it would have been perfectly just. Finally, once there were only a few minutes to go until the 10th question was revealed, everyone seemed to have completed the test. He idly wondered how the Konoha teams did, as well as Kankuro and Tamari. Finally, the clock showed that their 45 minutes were up, and everyone leaned forward in their chair expectantly as Ibiki explained the rules for the last question. Many of the genin were outraged, as was Naruto, although he said nothing. Drawing attention to himself at this point wouldn't do him or his friends any good, although if he knew them as well as he did, then Toyo was just as angry as he was. Even so, they calmly waited, not taking the bait as many teams began to forfeit from the exams. It was just unfortunate that they were using psychological warfare on their young minds, a subject that Baki-sensei just happened to be an expert in. They waited it out until it seemed there was nobody left that was going to leave, leaving the classroom much sparser than it had been at the start. Finally, Ibiki revealed the significance of the final question, and Naruto grinned wildly, knowing that he was through to the next round. It was certainly a good feeling as he put his feet up on the table in front of him, smiling broadly and soaking in the small victory. Ibiki was about to go on and explain further when the window to the right of the room suddenly burst inwards, showering the scared proctor with a hail of glass. 4 kunai shot through the new opening into the room, each attached to a corner of a large banner, which unfurled mid-flight. The kunai embedded themselves into the walls, proudly displaying the message and releasing the woman inside the walls. Proudly displaying inside simultaneously, Naruto just stared at her. Vibrant purple hair, a large tan trench coat, a skirt that was far from decent, not to mention her mesh shirt that only contained a thin gray shirt underneath, not leaving much to the imagination. "Heads up, boys and girls. This is no time to be celebrating. I'll be your next proctor, Anko Mitarashi." Most of the cheating hopefuls in the room just stared at her, wide-eyed and slack-jawed. Naruto, on the other hand, had to stifle a laugh at the brilliant entrance as he held a thumbs up to the eccentric but definitely interesting woman. Anko noticed this and smirked, glad at least one of the little brats could understand a good entrance. "Right then, are you ready for the second test? Good, now follow me." She stuck her hands up in a way that made Naruto have to stifle another laugh and only increased the awkward discomfort in the room. Ibiki appeared from around the side of the banner, looking highly irritated at the outlandish Tokubetsu Jonin's antics. "You're early. Again." Anko didn't exactly look pleased to hear that, and this time Naruto couldn't hold it back. He let out a loud laugh, which only further annoyed Anko. She recovered quickly, looking around the room at all the prospects, nodding her satisfactions. "Good work for once, Ibiki. Only 12 teams." Ibiki just sent her an irritated glare that she completely ignored. "Well, alright, maggots. You think you're so great because you survived this one little test? Well, by the time I'm through with you tomorrow morning, there'll be less than half of you left. I'll let your squad's leaders know where to meet tomorrow morning. Dismissed." And with that, everyone who had survived the first day of the tuning exams filed out of the room. Naruto, Tayuya, and Gaara were almost the last. He couldn't help it. When Naruto passed by the eccentric shinobi, he couldn't help but turn and compliment her. "Great entrance." Uncle immediately narrowed her eyes at the little punk that was mocking her, but she quickly understood he had meant it honestly. If the laughter still fresh on his face was evidence, she wasn't quite sure how to process it at first. Nobody ever really paid heed to her antics and pranks. In fact, most just ignored her completely. "Thanks, Kaki, but don't get too cocky. You're not going to like me if you make it through the second exam." Naruto only maintained his smile and stared at her. "We'll see." Before she could react, he was already at the door with Uncle watching him leave. A very amused Ibiki watched her rather shocked reaction, severing the unusual occurrence for a moment. "So, is that all it takes to get under your skin nowadays, Uncle? Blonde hair and a smile?" The irate Kunoichi rounded on the interrogation expert, her eyes flaming. "Oh, shut it, Scarface!" And like a flash, she was out of the small window she had made in by, leaving a rather startled Ibiki in her wake. "Boy, that was one strange kid. Funny, but strange." He grinned, but that quickly dissipated when he turned and realized that Uncle had left the banner up from her ridiculous entrance. With a groan, he ordered one of the chunin on the side of the room to tear it down before he walked out of the room in a much more irritable manner than he had entered. "That damn woman will be the death of me." Everyone just stared at the imposing sight in front of them. The trees the size of buildings, deadly animals in plain sight, and a general feeling of darkness and despair that emanated from the ominous training ground like a scent. Uncle stood in front of them, facing away from the flimsy piece of metal that someone might call a fence. She soaked in the awed and frightened faces, taking pleasure at how her personal training ground was having its usual effect. That was until she came across a certain spiky-haired blonde and his team. "Oh no! A forest with water and plenty of animals to hunt. However will we survive?" Out of nowhere, a kunai flew directly at him. He tried to dodge, but it had been so unexpected that it managed to nick his cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. Akko suddenly appeared behind him in an impressive show of speed, her mouth close to his ear. "So, we've got a tough guy, huh? Well, you should be worried. There's more than animals in that forest that are out for your blood." Her eyes opened wide when Naruto suddenly ceased to exist in front of her, and she felt a presence behind her back. Before she could react, a kunai was carefully placed against her cheek, and with a slight motion, it created a line about the same length as the one currently on Naruto's. At least she thought it was a kunai. Instead, when she angrily rounded on the cocky brat, she found him holding nothing but a pen. Of course, she understood the significance. She had let down her guard, and he was in a position where he could have mortally wounded her. She didn't know whether to feel furious, embarrassed, or a little turned on. After all, the Inuzakans weren't the only ones that were allowed to be weird when it came to these things. She angrily snatched the offending pen and snapped it with one hand, although much to her chagrin, he just smiled at her innocently. She glared at him, trying her best to hide her true feelings behind a mask of anger, even though he didn't look affected. Finally, she smiled, a chilling smile that only Uncle Mitarashi could pull off, and was a beacon to most leaf shinobi to run for the hills. "Nice one, Kaki. You got me." The tuning and a few of the jonin over at the gate waiting for the genin to sign the waivers. Sweat dropped. Everybody tuning or higher knew of Uncle's reputation, and this type of reaction wasn't part of it. She turned around to the rest of the genin who had just stared awkwardly through the whole confrontation and started announcing how the second start of the exam was going to work. Naruto just linked back over to his team where Tayuya smacked him in the back of the head. It didn't diminish his smirk, and he could see that she was equally amused by what he did. Uncle just stared at his retreating form, going back to his team. That was a kid to watch out for. She didn't know if he was all talk and bravado, but she felt like she would have fun finding out. She decided that for the first time since she had started doing the second test for the Chunin exams, she was going to watch from the tower's cameras. And there was also something nagging at the back of her mind, somebody he reminded her of, but she just couldn't place it. "You shithead, we're supposed to keep our skills under wraps until the last fucking round. Now everybody knows you're fast." Naruto just smiled at her, which made her involuntarily smile back. "They haven't seen anything yet." Every team had been given their respective scroll. All of them had signed the death waivers, and they all stood outside of their gates waiting for the signal to be given to start. Naruto took waiting to mean he had an opportunity to read his oh-so-enjoyable book. Toyuyo was eyeing him irritably, still not having caught up to him despite her persistence. Gaara was just idly leaning on the fence, wondering how long it was going to take them to find another team and get to the tower in the center. He smirked. Between his hand and Naruto's nose, they would get through this in an hour tops. He frowned slightly. It was a real shame that Tayuya hadn't come into her all yet. Them them not having use for genjutsu for now. He hoped that would change by the time they got to the last round at least. Perhaps it might even come in handy in the forced, but he doubted that slightly. Then again, it had proven useful for getting the drop on their enemies in the past. He made a promise not to let Tayuya's tremendous talents go to waste here. However, he didn't want to squeeze her into a plan for that reason alone. He shook his head clear of the thoughts. He was worrying over nothing. Tayuya was a valued and irreplaceable part of their team, and he wouldn't trade her for anybody. He smiled as he watched her scowl at Naruto. She may not be a jinjuriki, but she could certainly be as frightening as one. Suddenly, all three ninja received a small surprise as Anko dropped out of nowhere. However, the real surprising thing was that none of them reacted. Gaara wasn't sure if it was because he had smelled her coming or not, but Naruto didn't even look up from his book. He read on a few more lines before folding the corner of the page and slowly closing the book in a manner that always drove Baki-sensei insane. It was Naruto's method of royally annoying anybody of a higher rank than himself. Oh great, here I was thinking you guys might actually prove entertaining, and I find that you read those same stupid books as Kakashi. She seemed genuinely disappointed until Naruto reached behind him into the small pouch on his hip. Anko tensed, wary due to her last encounter, but he simply pulled his hand back around, holding onto an identical copy of the book in his other hand. He threw the small orange book over to the special jonin who deftly caught it and looked at the offending object like she might catch a disease from it. You should try reading it. You might actually enjoy it. And with that, Naruto seemed to almost dismiss her as he returned to reading his book. Anko just couldn't believe how this genin was acting around her. If she didn't know any better, she would think he was Kakashi's personal clone, except that wasn't quite right. It went beyond that. There it was again, that nagging feeling that she should know his face from somewhere. She decided to ask Kakashi himself about it, seeing as the two seemed to share so many similarities. She took off, quite intent on retreating from the unnatural cool blonde before he could embarrass her further, not even realizing she was still holding onto the present Naruto had given her. Naruto, on the other hand, had noticed and was smirking, one eye on Anko as she left. Tayuya didn't get a chance to berate him for his latest strange behavior, as with a buzz, the gates into the Forest of Death opened, and the three Sand Shinobi sprinted in. End of chapter 13.